Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Every writer hopes that their brand of writing within a certain genre will connect with readers. And one who has had an almost cinematic rise in this success is Freida Mcfadden, who The Hollywood Reporter recently introduced as the doctor turned author, who during the past 10 years has become one of the biggest selling names in publishing. She currently has 6 books in Amazon's top 20 chart of bestsellers. Never Lie spent 11 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and USA Today's best-selling books top 150 list, with 23 consecutive weeks on Publishers Weekly's bestseller list. While People magazine's rounded out this introduction with their own that for the uninitiated, Mcfadden is the international best-selling author of the Housemaid series and the New York Times bestseller of The Coworker. Deadline recently reported of the sensation that her Housemaid series become in the 2020s. That two-time Emmy nominee Rebecca Sonnenschein set to pen a feature adaptation of Freida Mcfadden's best-selling novel The Housemaid for Lionsgate. The psychological thriller unveiled by Bookouture, which has remained on the Amazon bestseller list for almost a year, follows a struggling woman who is relieved when she gets to start fresh as a housemaid to an upscale wealthy couple. Soon, however, she finds herself falling for the kind and attractive husband. From behind closed doors, she sees everything and soon learns that the Winchester secrets are far more dangerous than her own. Mcfadden remarkably also works as a practicing physician specializing in brain surgery. An impressive fact to highlight here and there is she turned out a staggering catalog of bestsellers alongside sequels to Housemaid's Secret, where USA Today promised readers that this absolutely explosive and shockingly twisty sequel will keep you racing through the pages late into the night, and the housemaid's watching. That then include going back a decade to the beginning in 2013 when the Dr. Jane McGill series first arrived over The Devil Wears Scrubs, Suicide Med, Brain Damage, The Devil in Scrubs, and The Devil You Know. While within the standalone realm, she began building her own brand of psychological thriller hits with The Surrogate Mother, The Ex, The Perfect Son, The Wife Upstairs, One by One, Want to Know a Secret? The Locked Door, Do Not Disturb, Do You Remember? The Inmate, Never Lie, The Gift, Ward D and The Coworker, all before Forbes recently broke the news in Market Impact that Freida Mcfadden, whose 2024 book The Teacher is among the most widely sold of the year, is the third best-selling author in the category with 1.61 million print copies sold, followed by Anna Huang with 1.47 million and Rebecca Yarrow with 1.28 million sales. While in ebook and audio, Mcfadden has sold more than 3.6 million copies and counting. A trend that continued over The Boyfriend and The Crash. And she takes a break out of her busy schedule to join us today and talk about it all. Freida, welcome to the show. The New York Times, in a feature profile, noted of your reading roots that growing up in Midtown Manhattan, Mcfadden was a brainy kid, a math team member who loved reading and filled up composition notebooks with stories. Her father, a psychiatrist, constantly pressed literary fiction into her hands, while her mother, a podiatrist, introduced her to suspense and thriller writers like Mary Higgins Clark and Robin Cook. Growing up, who else could we have found you counting among your favorite authors?
I always loved to read. My first love was the Babysitter's Club. I have to throw that out there. And then Judy Blume. So all the things you'd expect a young girl to enjoy were things that I enjoyed. And then when I was a little older, like 10 or 11-ish, my mom, and I was a strong reader, my mom was reading these thriller books. And I was watching her and I was like, oh, can I have one? And so she let me read them. I think the first was Mary Higgins Clark, who's like the OG of thrillers. She's amazing. And I loved it. And from then, I think, I was a mature enough reader that then I only wanted to read adult books. So I remember my favorites were Mary Higgins Clark, of course. I read Robin Cook. I was into that medical stuff. F. Paul Wilson was another favorite of mine. Stephen King I got into. So I was really just, I loved all of those books. It would never have ever occurred to me to want to become an author. It just didn't feel like a real career. Like, it's like, becoming like a princess or an astronaut. I mean, yeah, okay, astronauts are real, but it's not something that like most people become. So it wasn't a real career to me. So it was something I would do as a hobby, and I recognized that it will always be a hobby. And being a doctor was the thing that I actually wanted to do as a real career.
So did you begin writing the Dr. Jane McGill series on long overnight residency shifts when it was quiet on the ward, within creating what will become your debut, The Devil Wears Scrubs?
I've always been writing. Like there were times when I didn't quite have enough time. Like I'd say when I was a resident and also had a baby, that was a time when I did not have time to write. But anytime, I always say to people, when people say, "Oh, I can't find time to write," I say people find time for the things that are important to them, that they want to find time for. And writing was something I loved. So it was something I always found time for. I didn't find time to exercise, but I found time to write. And so I had, they weren't published, but I have probably dozens and dozens of stories and books that I wrote from like age 9 through when I published this when I was, in my 30s. So this was the first book that I published, but it was not the first book. I wrote a book. As I said, I've written many. I actually landed an agent and she shopped it for a year. Nothing. Rejected, dropped. And a few other times, like I wrote things and I queried agents and nothing came of it, just a lot of no's. So when I wrote The Devil Wears Scrubs, I was aware of self-publishing and I didn't even feel like going down that rejection route. I knew I had an online presence with this blog that I participated in. And I was like, I'll just publish it and people will buy it, I'm sure. Like I made it cheap. And that was exactly what happened. I published my book. And I got my wish. People wrote it. And I had a book that I could hold in my hands. And I was happy. I was like, this is all I wanted. This is all I needed. I published my book. A few hundred people bought it. Done. It didn't work out that way.
Is it fair to say that Suicide Med reflected the real life pressures of being a medical student?
It's very much. I actually took a lot of stories from this like little diary I kept during my first year of medical school in anatomy. So a lot of the stories in it are real stories that happened to me. But obviously it unfolds in a way that is not even what happened to me. It's a thriller. Nobody was murdered in my class. It's all good.
Within brain damage and the scope of the affliction that Dr. Charlie McKenna is battling, what measures do you take to reflect the realism of the condition that a character like this can find themselves in with an injury like this as it affects the story that follows?
I wrote it, I think it was around 2015, I published it. It was based on real experiences also as working as a brain injury physician. So like loosely based on some real experiences that I kind of turned into a story. So I get a lot of emails from people who work in brain injury, from like therapists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, and they're all like, this is the most realistic book about, therapy and brain injury I've ever seen. And they were like, you must work in the field. I'm like, yeah.
Now, is it safe to assume that the next duology that continued over The Devil in Scrubs and The Devil You Know, that came amid your writing more in the solo noveling realm, was a reflection of fan demand for more of Dr. Jane McGill and Company?
Definitely not reader demand. It was more just a story I had to tell. The first book was sort of my struggles during my intern year. And that book was sort of my struggles with being a new attending and dealing with like marriage and having a young child. So it was a little bit more cathartic to write than anything else.
The Surrogate Mother really does present a scenario that happened to a character like Abby if she wound up with a head case like Monica in that role. How would this be an example of your process for settling on a specific premise before a story like this roller coaster ride gets going?
I think what had happened, looking back, is I had started reading a lot of domestic thrillers. And as I mentioned, I'm an avid reader, and I'd read a bunch of domestic thriller books and I really enjoyed them. Like it was like my new genre. I bounced from genre to genre. And I was like, I would love to write one of these. So I, diverged from what I had been doing before and I tried writing this domestic thriller. And I loved writing it. So that was my first one. That's along what I said about like people making terrible decisions and then having to live with the consequences. Yeah, like people will read it and be like, why would she do that? What a stupid thing to do. I'm like, yeah. So, and now you get to see what happens. It's the train wreck that you can't stop watching.
Does that become addictive, so to speak, as a writer?
Yeah, I'm always hoping to read something like that, and I don't see it as much as I want. So then I'm like, well, I'm just gonna make it if I can't find it.
The X is definitely a scenario that everyone fears when they're beginning a new relationship, where Francesca here and Joel are, quote, just friends, and Cassie has every reason to be suspect of Francesca's intentions. What was it like to watch your brand of psychological thriller catch on as this book took off up the charts?
I would say The X was my first domestic thriller that really took off. I'm not sure why. I think there was something compelling, maybe about the blurb or the cover. I learned a lot from writing it. It was fun to write. It was a lot of that cringe factor. This woman going from, being in a comfortable relationship to living in this like micro apartment in Manhattan and maxing out all her credit cards. And I think what I learned most about it, though, was about plotting. And it has a twist in it that is super, super, super twisty to the point where I think it's too twisty. Like, I sort of realized there's an upper limit to how twisty you could be. And that one, I think it went too far. It crossed that line. And not to say that some people don't love it, but it doesn't appeal to the masses, I think, the way that the somewhat simpler twists are. And I mean, I try to make my twists very twisty, but this one, it was a little too, I think, a little too mind bending. And it was a point where, my mother reads all my books. That was like 5 years ago. She still doesn't understand it. I think I've explained it to her like 5 times, 10 times. And she's like, I still don't get it. I'm sorry. I will never understand this ending.
Now, it's every parent's worst nightmare, facing a scenario like Erica Cass does when the cops show up at her door to ask about her son Liam's possible involvement in a girl's disappearance. How long had this idea been turning in your imagination before it made its way onto the page?
It's funny because this is actually a revision, not a revision, but a reworking of something that I wrote when I was in college. So it was more just about the life of a boy who's just, has this kind of, he's just like this bad kid. And it was something that a 20-year-old would write. It was not that well plotted. It was okay. But I think that idea just like never left my head. And then, when I wrote The Perfect Son, at that point, I was a mother. So I kind of came at it from a different direction. Back then, I was writing from the point of view kind of the kid, because I was young, but now I'm a mom. So I wrote it from the mom point of view. And I think that worked much better.
Taking the wife upstairs as an example, would you unravel the complexities of crafting a story with a character like Victoria Barnett, afflicted with a condition like this? How complicated a landscape does that present for you as you're crafting the story?
I loved writing the present day because it involves something that I'm really comfortable with, which is brain injury. So she had a brain injury, and whether she was more impaired than she let on, she was very impaired. I mean, she had, a brain injury, and writing that, she has something called aphasia, which I think people don't necessarily know about, where, you can't get words out. And I could give a little lecture on this. I won't. But, and people will say, well, why can't she just write? I'm like, it applies to writing too. It's a problem with language. It's not like if you don't speak Spanish, it's not like you could write Spanish. Like it's all the same thing. So I think writing a character with that, I'd never done anything like that before. It was challenging, but also, interesting for me. But then also the previous point of view, the past, was, building like sort of a character study of narcissistic personality disorder. And I researched it a lot, and I know of people who have it and, are or should say married to people who have it. So I think that was a challenge too. Again, creating this terrible situation with a woman making terrible decisions and then things playing out just as you feared that they would.
The woods is always an irresistible backdrop to set a story like this one loose in. Do you personally fear this scenario of becoming lost or stranded in them, as your characters become within the pages of One by One?
Writing down your biggest fears is sometimes very cathartic. I'm not an outdoorsy person. So like every time I have to go camping or out in the woods, I'm just so scared. And like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like if the people I was with abandoned me, I would never find my way out again. I would be, being in the woods is like the scariest thing I can imagine. So being lost in the woods, I mean, I feel like it just writes itself. It's just so scary to me. And then having somebody sort of hunting them possibly in that kind of Blair Witch Project kind of way, like that's like my worst nightmare. So it was again a fun one to write.
We'd love to know what's buried in YouTube cook show star April Masterson's backyard. Her stalker would like to as well. How much did you feel the fear tingling up and down your own spine as you were writing? Want to know a secret?
It was very fun to write the suburban neighborhood. I think April's son was about the same age as my child when I was writing it. So a lot of it was kind of inspired by things that were happening in my present day, somewhat suburban life. So that was very fun. And, I also love to bake. So a lot of like her kind of baking stuff it's stuff I love to talk about. So it's very fun to write about her little baking tips. And, even though I don't think she is actually like me, it was a lot of things that she went through were kind of inspired by my real life at the time that I wrote it.
Now, when did you begin telling Nora Davis' story here? Did you start as an adult and write backward from there through her memories and the locked door, even as she's revealed to have the same homicidal bloodline as her father, but with different intentions on why she does what she does here?
I think when I wrote that, I'm trying to remember, I wrote the present first, and then I wrote the past part second. But I sort of had an idea how it was all gonna unfold. Like in my head, I knew what her background was, and she was also fun to write. First of all, she's a doctor like me, so that was a little bit, I mean, it's easy to anyone who works in a medical field, it's sort of easy to fall into that. It's like second nature. So that part was easy, but she was kind of cool and aloof in a way that I'm really not. So I kind of like admired her a little bit. So that made it a little more fun to write, like stepping into the shoes of somebody who you think is cooler than you are. I would say anywhere from the first draft, anywhere from 2 weeks to a month. But that's just the first draft. So like there's the planning phase before, which is several months. And then I write the first draft, but then the editing can take years. When I'm writing a book, I am eating, breathing, showering that book. And that's part of why I try to write them quickly because it's so consuming. I can't think of anything else. Like it's the last thought I have when I'm falling asleep at night. Like, how's this scene gonna go? And then when I wake up, it's the first thought I have, like, and while I'm lying in bed, like waiting for my alarm to go off, because I always wake up before my alarm. Like, I'm like, oh, how's this scene gonna go? So it really consumes me when I'm writing it. It's like all around me. It's what I'm thinking about all the time. So, it really helps me to like become immersed in it. And just when I do sit down to actually write, to just go, because I've been planning scenes all night long.
What is your preferred method acting, or whatever you'd call the process for being in that terrified headspace when writing a story like the one you do in Do Not Disturb, as a chilling and at the same time thrilling example?
I'm always trying to like make their situation as terrible as it possibly can be. Like when I'm writing a scene, I'm always thinking to myself, how could this be worse for them? How could this be like you're driving a car And, this doesn't happen in this book, but there's a dead body in the trunk. What could happen now to make this situation more tense? Oh, you get pulled over by a cop, or, like you're at a gas station and you run into somebody who won't stop asking you questions. Like, I'm always thinking, or, the trunk is broken and now it won't close. I always think to myself, what could make this worse? What could make this more awkward, more cringy, more scary? Like, I'm never satisfied with the level of tension. I'm always brainstorming, like, how could this be worse? I love to torture my protagonist. She finds this place where, it's possibly a refuge, but now she's got this creepy wife possibly watching her, and there's this psychic woman in the hotel with her, basically telling her she's gonna die, like there's danger coming. And and now the police show up, and it just keeps snowballing to the point where it's maximally bad.
Do you like to know the ending ahead of the snowball crashing, so to speak?
I do know my ending when I get started in a book. Like, that's the part I'm usually pretty sure about. Sometimes I don't know all the details, and I'm just kind of waiting to see how it will all play out. Especially, people love that one last twist, and sometimes I don't quite have it together, but I always think to myself, I'll come up with it. It will come to me as I'm writing, and it almost always does.
Could you give viewers a sense of what it's like writing from the point of view of someone with amnesia, as you do with Tess Strebel and Do You Remember?
It was definitely like fun to write that perspective, because I think what I found interesting about that story is she's a little unreliable, and the unreliable narrator is very popular now. But by the second day, you kind of know more than she does. Even though you only have her perspective, you have information she doesn't have, because she's forgotten everything that just happened in the story. So the first day you're kind of with her, but then the second day things her husband did, things people said to her, and you kind of know who's lying, but she doesn't know. So I thought that was very interesting about it. And it actually kind of reminded me a little bit of Memento as some of my inspiration for that, because that movie was shot backwards, which was very, very interesting. And things that the I don't know what to call the hero in that movie doesn't know. So I thought that was an interesting concept of the reader knowing more than the narrator telling the story.
The New York Times broke the news within the release of The Housemaid that 11 years, 23 books, and more than 6 million copies after she self-published her first novel, Mcfadden has become the fastest-selling thriller writer in the United States and a seemingly permanent fixture on the bestseller list. She's currently the top-selling thriller writer in the United States, beating brand names like James Patterson, David Baldacci, and John Grisham so far this year, according to Circana Bookscan. Her addictive psychological thrillers are plastered across Amazon's bestseller rankings, where she's held the top spot on the Kindle bestselling list and had 6 novels in the top 50. She also sells enormous quantities in print, not only by brick-and-mortar bookstores, but in grocery and pharmacy chains like Kroger, Aldi, and Albertsons. Since last August, Poison Pen has released 7, with 2 more due out this fall. It's an unusually packed publication schedule for a single author, but the pace barely satisfies Mcfadden's insatiable readers, who call themselves Mcfans. Before revealing that in 2019, she came up with The Housemaid, a novel about a desperate woman named Millie, who's living in her car, unable to find work because of her criminal past. She's thrilled to land a job as a live-in maid for a wealthy family on Long Island, until she discovers that her boss's seemingly perfect life and marriage are a facade. In the spring of 2022, the book became a monster hit, went on to sell more than 2 million copies, and was optioned for film by Lionsgate. It's been on Amazon's bestseller list for 83 weeks and spent 60 weeks on the New York Times trade paperback bestseller list. Mcfadden almost didn't publish it. Good thing for fans of this sensation of a series that you changed your mind. Please give them their own introduction to what first inspired this hit-making concept and why you feel it works so well once you began telling Millie's story here.
I I sort of like the idea of an employee being treated poorly because I've kind of been in that situation before, not recently, but years ago. And I also like situations where that are just very cringy because somebody is sort of being treated so badly. I love the cringe. Like, if you're familiar with the show The Office, but they're so good at the cringe, and I love it. I'm there for it. So that's kind of what I was going for. It was sort of like this bad boss story about this housemaid being mistreated by her boss. And the question is why? Why is this boss being so awful to her? So, and yeah, it was just one idea I had, and I meant for it to be one book. And then, after it took off, I thought I had an idea for another one, and I thought, okay, now I'll do a second one. And I remember when I gave it to my editor at Bookouture, my publisher, she said, "Oh, and maybe I'll do a third one." And I like laughed. I was like, "No, I won't. That's ridiculous." Millie, is she gets a job working as a housemaid for a rich couple called the Winchesters. And a lot of crazy things happen while she's there. And the ending, I'm very well known for my epilogues, like this extra little twist at the end I always throw in. And the epilogue in this case really kind of opened the door for more. And people kept saying online, "Oh, do you think there'll be another one?" And I love to give people what they want. So I went ahead and wrote it.
Within writing the smash hit sequel, The Housemaid's Secret, could you give your fans a little bit of a look at how your plotting process works?
There was also a character in the book that people really loved, and they wanted more of that character. I don't want to give this away, but I also wrote it to give people more of that character that they enjoyed so much. I plot out stories in my head. Sometimes I'll see people say online, "Oh, she just came up with this at the last second, this twist." No, I never do that. It's all in my head, and I usually plan it out for a few months before I write even a word. But I don't write anything down. I don't make any flow charts. I don't sketch out scenes or outlines. It's all in my brain. And when I start writing, I'm open to the idea that a character I didn't expect to grab me might grab me, or I'll come up with an idea that like didn't occur to me would be amazing. As somebody who has had, people working for me in the past and has known a lot of people who have employed people in their house, like I wanted it to be different, but also kind of fall back on some of the stories I've heard from people I know. And I didn't want, either the housemaid or the couple really to be the intolerable one. I sort of wanted it to be uncertain, like who really is the person who's bad. Like I like to sort of play with people's expectations about that. And I like, the person who you think is the worst, maybe they turn out to be the best, or maybe they turn out to be even worse than you possibly thought. So I just like to play with that expectation.
Did The Housemaid reach out and grab you right away as the winning title? And how does that all-important part of the novel writing process usually work for you?
My publisher, Bookouture, chose the titles. So they, I think it had to do with like, secret is like a buzzword in books. It's trending. I don't know. So they said, "Gonna be Housemaid's Secret." I'm like, great.
Parade magazine and picking up the continued coverage of this series' sales as it became a resounding hit with readers, reported that medical doctor Freida Mcfadden proves writing a best-selling thriller isn't brain surgery, though she's done that too with her latest hit. The Housemaid is Waiting debuts at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, the third in a series that also includes The Housemaid, sitting pretty at #8, and The Housemaid's Secret. So Mcfadden's the rare author to enjoy seeing two of their books in the chart at the same time. What can your fans look forward to in picking up this wrap-up to the On Its Way to the Silver Screen series?
So that one I actually did come up with the title because I saw a lot of books with watching in the title. I'm like, oh, people like to read about watching. So, but yes, again, that was one I did not expect to write. And the idea just hit me. And usually, when you have a series, you try to release them close together. And this one is like over a year after the second one because I absolutely did not plan it. So I did this so badly in terms of like business decisions. But, the idea hit me and I was like, I want to write this. And I didn't want to write it just for the sake of writing it. I didn't want to write it just because it's a franchise and people like it. I wanted to write something that I could be proud of and that would make people feel good about the series. Like I wanted to put a nice bow on it at the end. So it takes place a long time after the first one and a long time after the second one, many years in the future. And Millie, the protagonist, is now married with children. So it's a very different story too. But I think it also brings in a lot of elements that I think people liked about the first two books. So I really kind of wanted it to celebrate the first two books in a way that, I find really satisfying when I'm watching a series. I was telling someone recently, I saw the latest Spider-Man 3 movie, that No Way Home. I'm a massive Spider-Man fan. So like I saw the 3 with Tobey Maguire, I saw the ones with like Andrew Garfield, and now the new ones with Tom Holland. Anything with Spider-Man, I'm there for it. I love it. So I just saw this, not that recently, but in the movies, I saw No Way Home, and I was like, wow, this movie had everything that I love about Spider-Man in it. It was just like a celebration of the entire series. And I was like, I want that. I want Housemaid 3 to be that. I want it to just be a celebration of the Housemaid. So that was sort of my inspiration in a way.
Would you give us a sense of what it felt like becoming a New York Times bestseller, not once, not twice, but multiple times over the same year?
Definitely my agent who told me. I don't remember where I was, but I have to say I was completely stunned. Oh no, now that you're talking about it, I do remember. I had a list of every week from my publisher, I get a list of sales. And I remember talking to my agent. I was like, what do you think I need to hit New York Times bestseller? And she's like, well, it really varies. You can't predict these things. And I'm like, never going to hit it. Forget it. I'm not even going to think about it. And then I kind of put it out of my head. And then I think it was like 5 o'clock. And she calls me and she's like, you did it. I was like, no, I was completely in disbelief. I mean, this was an ebook that I published, and somehow it was unthinkable for it to hit the New York Times bestseller list. Like that publisher, Bookouture, had never had a book on the New York Times bestseller list before. So it was not really, it was a life goal perhaps, but it wasn't like a goal with that book. I was just, trying to get a few more readers, a little more legitimacy. So I was really stunned. And for it to continue to be on there week after week, it's been nearly a year now. I mean, I'm still stunned. I'm continually stunned every week. The Housemaid.
USA Today promised your Mcfaddens around the world that they could expect a gripping, twisty thriller with The Inmate, reasoning in their 4-star review that the guiltiest people aren't always the ones behind bars. As a new nurse practitioner at a maximum security prison, Brooke Sullivan is taught 3 crucial rules. Treat all prisoners with respect, never reveal any personal information, and never ever become too friendly with the inmates. When did you first begin playing around with the idea here of placing her in the same maximum security prison as her ex Shane Nelson, who's there based on her testimony, and what they conclude is ultimately a propulsive, mind-bending thriller about how we define guilt and who has to pay for it?
So she does in the story, and that's kind of what I loved about it, that it's the horrible decision thing. Like, you're entering this situation, you shouldn't, it's going to go wrong, but you do it anyway, and then of course it goes wrong exactly how everybody knows it will. And then just kind of watching the train wreck happen. I never actually worked in a prison, but I worked at a county hospital for about a year, and we used to see a lot of prisoners. They would be like shackled to the bed, and they were just regular people. There wasn't anything that eventful about it. Although I remember I went in to see one of them on my rounds, and he was gone, and I was really nervous. I was like, oh no, did he escape? But he was fine. He was getting a CAT scan, so it was fine. But I'm not, I've never worked in a prison, but I know people who have. And I actually spent some time talking to somebody who worked as a PA at a prison, and they like told me some stuff about it and gave me some stories to use. So, I did do some research in that way. That was another one I found really fun to write. It was, I barely, it just wrote itself, honestly. Like it was just exactly how, you would expect her to react to this person who, did this terrible thing. And yet, I don't want to give anything away, but she has this sort of connection to him that can't be broken and that is very meaningful.
The Hollywood Reporter, amid your whirlwind of success, recently reported the headline that 21 Laps Entertainment, the production banner founded by Deadpool and Wolverine filmmaker Sean Levy, and Netflix have teamed up to adapt Never Lie, the bestseller by author Freida Mcfadden. Described as being in the tone of Gone Girl, the novel follows a newlywed couple on a search for the house of their dreams when they come upon a remote manor that once belonged to a renowned psychiatrist, a woman who vanished 4 years earlier. Trapped at the estate due to an intense blizzard, the wife happens upon a secret room containing audio tapes of the psychiatrist's interview with her patients. Discovering one session is with a sociopath who sounds scarily familiar to her. Playing within this locked door mystery space, do you write Dr. Hale's tape sections first, or as Trisha discovered and was listening to them?
That's a great question. Whenever my books have two like alternating time periods, like the past and the present, I always write them separately. So I wrote not just the audio tapes, but I wrote Adrian's entire narrative. And then I went back and I wrote Trisha's entire narrative. And then I put them together. I assembled it. I love assembling it. That's the best part. Like, there's usually a very clear, way they should go together just to amp up the tension. So it's sort of like when you're making we recently made this like book nook, and we made all of these little furniture to go inside of it. And then at the end, we had to put it all together. And it was so much fun. So it's kind of like that. If I were to keep switching back and forth as I was writing it, I think it would have taken me out of the story. I just wanted to focus on one story at a time. And they were both actually really fun to write. Some stories are more fun to write than others, and that was definitely one of the more fun ones to put together.
It must have been irresistible within the story you unwrap in the gift for fans to not set a thriller at Christmas.
It was definitely a last minute kind of decision. It's not a novel, it's a novella. It's actually a novelette. It's not quite a novella, but it's a little longer than a short story. So, yes, that is a novelette. And I just, it was a little bit before Christmas, and I was just, I hadn't put out a book in a while, and I knew I didn't have any new ones coming out for a couple months. And I know people love Christmas stories. They were all over Amazon. So I'm like, I'm going to write a short story / novelette that has a Christmas theme. And one of my favorite short story that is The Gift of the Magi by O. Henry. I don't know if you know about that. I had a book of O. Henry short stories when I was a kid. He's this author, and his thing is like every story at the end has like a twist, but they're short stories. They're like 2 pages each. So the Gift of the Magi is a very, very well-known short story. I think, the woman cuts off her hair to buy her husband a chain for his watch, and then he sells his watch to buy her comb. So the irony, very heartwarming. So I decided to do it like a thriller like twist on that, like have it take, start out a little similarly, but then take an extremely dark turn. So I thought that would be really fun, and it was very, easy to do. And I think a lot of people just got a kick out of it.
Safe to assume you're drawing on your own background once again as you became medical student Amy Brenner as she winds up trapped in Ward D.
The character in this story is a third-year medical student, and it was very much based on So in third year of medical school, you go and do these different clerkships through different parts of the hospital. So you do, general medicine, OBGYN, surgery, and psychiatry is one of them. So we had to do a month on an inpatient psychiatric unit. And so this was kind of based on my experience that month, all kind of compressed into one night and made a lot more murdery. So that's like my favorite thing. Like the more claustrophobic of a setting and the shorter a time span, the more fun it is to just pack so many things into that short period of time. I don't know, there's just something compelling about it to me. I think it's just fun to just, everything feels more immediate. Like you're gonna die and it's gonna happen tonight.
Setting a whodunit in an office. What if you're sitting next to the killer in a cubicle? Sounds like writing the coworker must have been a blast, and we understand in true MD fashion that you actually dictate your books to yourself, first write them in a computer?
The reason I started doing that was because a few years ago I hurt my wrist really badly. It was like bothering me a lot. And I wanted to keep writing. So I was like, oh, I'll just start dictating. And I actually just dictate using Siri into an iPad. And it's super easy and it's very good at picking up my voice. And then my wrist got better enough. And I wanted to go think about going back to typing. But after dictating, it just seems so slow and I couldn't go back. I was like addicted to it. And I also, I'm a physician and we dictate a lot at work. So it's something I'm very familiar with. So like now, and it's very similar to writing, but I could just go much, much faster. So I don't think my writing is any different. Like, I don't think if you looked at something I wrote and something I dictated, like 2 scenes, I don't think you'd say, oh, this one's clearly dictated. Unless you saw it right after I dictated it, then you would realize because of the like homonyms that are ridiculous. But they're very similar. I think I don't know, one style started to get closer to the other, but I don't think there's a huge difference there. Also, I haven't worked in office in years, but I used to. I actually used to work for for a short period of time in an investment banking company. I won't say the name of it, but and I had like my little cubicle and my husband also used to work in a cubicle for a while. So I think it's something people find very familiar to them. A lot of people work in that setting. So I like that about it. And I just, for that one, I think it was more about, what happens in the office, like the dynamics, how, there's all this sort of almost schoolyard pettiness and like people talking behind everyone else's backs. And I sort of just wanted to capture that in the coworker. So that was sort of part of my inspiration for that.
Do you like to sound out your characters' voices as you're dictating?
I don't. I actually talk very quietly because I don't want people in my house to hear me doing it. Like I feel like a little embarrassed. I'm like almost like whispering into it.
Turning to a more recent release like The Teacher, what do you enjoy most these days about weaving in your expected stylistic signatures while giving the reader a variety of scenarios throughout? And in that spirit, was this based on a rip from the headline story about a teacher-student affair?
When I was in high school, I don't know how much I'm allowed to get into that, but when I was in high school, there were some scandals at my school that were very memorable at the time. Nobody was arrested, but a lot of teachers were fired. And it really just stuck in my mind because I think there was a lot of bad behavior and people were ignoring it for a long time. Like, oh, we know this teacher does this, but that's just how he is, like there's nothing, anyone ever did about it. And finally, some brave student kind of came forward and, I think she went to a reporter about it and it all came out. And, it just stuck in my mind. And like, that was sort of my inspiration for this. I like to write first person. Almost all of my books are in first person. I just feel really comfortable with it. And I also, I actually dictate a lot of my books, the first draft at least. I do my edits on my laptop, but so it's very conversational. And I think people like that about my writing, that seems very conversational and easily accessible. And I think that's part of why, because I'm literally talking. So it certainly makes first person easier to write. And I also, I have a teenager now. So it's something I feel sort of close to right now, like the way teenagers talk, the way teenagers think. So it was a very comfortable thing for me to write at this time in my life.
People magazine promised fans that Freida Mcfadden is back with another mind-bending thriller, promising this time you'll never see the twist coming, as the boyfriend follows Sydney Shaw, who, like just about every eligible bachelorette in New York, has terrible dating luck. So when she finds the perfect boyfriend, she can finally breathe easy. That is until a woman turns up dead, and the police suspect a mystery man is stalking and murdering women he meets on dates. And Sydney is starting to have her suspicions about Mr. Perfect. And speaking of perfect, why did New York City prove to be the ideal co-star here in setting?
I'm from New York City, so it's still, even though I live in Boston now, it's still somehow the most comfortable city for me to write about. It's just like my city. I don't know. I don't know why. I can't get away from it. So when I thought about, writing a dating story in a city, it had to be New York because it's just ingrained for me. And even though I'm also married, I have memories of bad dates in the past. And I also have a lot of friends who are single, newly single or less newly single, and they're all going through the online dating stuff. And I live vicariously through them, hearing their stories. So it feels like something, I hear a lot about that I'm very familiar with. So I've always kind of been wanting to write a story like this. But I think what's different about The Boyfriend is that you also get the male point of view in that book. And I don't think you see that in a lot of like terrible dating story, especially terrible dating thrillers. So I think it's a little different from the typical one for that reason. And I think it has a good twist. So I hope people like it.
Could you give fans a peek at what it looks like when you're slipping off into Sydney's?
He was very fun to write. His point of view actually takes place many years previously, when he was a teenager. So you're kind of reading his narrative from many years ago, and you're not sure if this is a good narrative or a bad narrative or where it's going to go. So I think that's sort of interesting. And Sydney was a little bit more challenging just because you want her. Something I get people complain about is my characters making bad decisions in books. And I own that. My characters make terrible decisions, but sometimes they have to because that's what makes the story interesting. If all they do is like, this doesn't seem right, I'm going to call the police. That's kind of the end of the story a lot of the time. So they have to make a few bad decisions, but I didn't want it to be so over the top that readers are like, oh my God, this person's just too stupid to live. I have to stop reading. So it was that balance that was challenging.
How much fun do you have playing out the aftermath of a bad decision?
Oh, definitely the aftermath, like somebody doing something really ridiculous and then it going wrong exactly as they should have known it would.
You write at such a prolific pace to keep up with fan demand. What can they look forward to getting their hands on next?
I'm writing something now where this children's birthday party becomes the center of the book. And I wasn't even planning that. But as soon as like it turned out to be the child's birthday, suddenly I was like, wait, that's going to be great. So it's really just as I'm writing, I let it evolve.
Finally, as someone who's been at this for over 2 decades now, while balancing being a mother and a brain doctor, what's your advice to other busy aspiring writers on how you juggled it all to such great success?
I just feel like always moving forward, always taking chances. Like there were times when I was offered an opportunity and I thought, should I do this? Should I sign with Book of Tour? I'm happy with self-publishing. Should I pay for these ads? They're very expensive. They might not work. Should I write another book and push it out? And I feel like every time I pushed forward and went for it, it paid off. And, maybe not every time, but I never regretted a chance that I took. I think, the more chances you take, even if like 10 to 20% of them pay off, that's still something if you take enough chances. So I'm always telling people, just go for it. The worst that could happen is you publish your book and people don't like it. Well, so what? Publish another one. So I think just go for it. That's what I always say to people. It's definitely been a challenge. Up until recently, I was working. I cut back about 5 years ago from like full time to sort of half to 2/3 time. And I was trying to make it work, but when I started working with publishers instead of self-publishing, it was a lot harder. And over the summer, I was a mess. Like I realized I couldn't do it anymore. And, it was becoming really, really stressful for me. I think there was one week where I was so behind on publishing stuff. I asked for a week off, which I got. It was hard to arrange, but I got it. And I got caught up and I was happy. And then a week later, I was behind again. So I realized I couldn't do it anymore. So at the end of December, I stepped back from my job at the hospital and, I still go in, 1 to 2 days a week because it's just not something I ever really want to give up being a doctor, but I really, this is kind of my dream and I really just wanted to focus on it for now. And maybe someday I'll go back, but for now, this is kind of what I have to follow. It's an opportunity that a lot of people don't get, and I'm really grateful for it. So I want to see where it leads me. It was hard, and it was getting harder. So I think now I have a better balance. Like I recently wrote this book, and I actually had time to work on it, and I wasn't stressed, and I was actually, it wasn't like me being so angry at anyone who interrupted me because like this is the only time I have. Leave me alone. So I'm nicer to be around now.
Freida, it's been a blast speaking today. Thank you for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Okay, bye.